Today we shall understand the concepts of the levels of meaning at which reading comprehension is done and what are the different types of RC question types which test the different levels of meaning. So these concepts are covered in chapter 10. We will be discussing the reading task 3, which is based on a CAT 2005 RC passage regarding the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization. Before reading the passage, I would like to highlight a few things because the very first para is drawing parallels between two periods of history, the first age of globalization and the second age of globalization. So, the first age of globalization was the colonial times, which had reached its full peak in the early 20th century. So, Edward VII ruled from 1901 to 1910, which period was a glorious period for colonialism, or the first stage of globalization, where the whole world was connected through trade, where every colonial power was trading with its colonies, and the sun never set on the British Empire. So that refers to Edward VII's rule from 1901 to 1910, the Edwardian summer, which obviously relates to the first stage of globalization. Then we know that globalization broke down with the starting of First World War in 1914 to 18. Then then there was the Great Depression, the rise of Nazism, then World War II. So virtually the whole world remained deglobalized. After World War II, we had the Cold War. So it was only sometime in the 90s. So officially, the second age of globalization started only with the formation of the WTO on 1st January 1995. And that's when it was decided that within 10 years, all nations will uh, fully gear up their system for this globalized trade, free trade all over the world. And within 10 years, by 1st January 2005, the whole world will be fully globalized. So, this passage is being written in 2005 when the WTO regime has supposedly to have come into effect, the full regime, though obviously it didn't because there were so many areas of contention. But second age of globalization, the period that we are talking of is 1995 to 2005, the 10-year period. And the first stage of globalization, the Edwardian summer, was during during 1901 to 1910, the first decade of the 20th century, when Edward VII ruled in Britain. So, with this background, let's start reading. Crinoline and croquet are out. Crinoline is a cloth or used for the fine ladies' dresses. Croquet is a gentleman's game played with a wooden mallet and a ball on grass, leisurely class, so that colonial Raj, the ladies and gents are rich, wealthy, enjoying their pastime. So crinoline and croquet are out. They were there during 1901 to 1910, right? Now they are not there. As yet, no political activists have thrown themselves in front of the Royal Derby on Derby Day. During that period, obviously there was strain. There was economic strain even during those glorious days of Edwardian summer in 1901 to 1910. And there were, labor was under stress. That is why you had political activists who, let's say, horse racing is happening on Derby Day and somebody jumps himself and kills himself to draw the attention of everybody to their cause, because otherwise the rich people are not bothered about what kind of lives the poor are leading, right? So so during that time, political activists may have thrown themselves like this to draw attention to their plight. As of now, none have done it during the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization. Even so, some historians can spot the parallels. So, what are the parallels between that period of 1901 to 1910 to 1995 to 2005? Right, these 2 decades. So, the parallel is that it is a period of rapid technological change, which is now happening and which was happening then also. It is a period when the dominance of the world superpower. Then the superpower was Britain with the largest empire. Today the superpower is USA. So the dominance of world superpower is coming under threat. That time it was coming under threat from the rise of Germany and Japan and USA itself, right? And now US's superpower dominance is coming under threat from the rise of China, particularly, as well as India. It is an epoch where prosperity masks underlying economic strain. So both were periods, including now, when there is GDP growth is there, so there is prosperity, right? Standard of living is high generally of people. That is hiding the fact that economic problems are brewing. There is economic strain, underlying economic strain, which could take an ugly turn anytime in the future. But since GDP is growth is good, people are lulled into a sense of complacency. So crucially, the word crucially is a comment adverb. So the author is commenting कि ये बात crucial है, कि ये ऐसा वक्त है कि when policy makers are confident that all is in the best of all possible worlds. So the policy makers are not seeing the underlying economic strain. They are complacent because the prosperity around is masking all that. So this point is crucial, that the policy makers are complacent. They are unable to see the underlying economic strain. So obviously, the purpose of this article you can predict is to then author would like to highlight, bring to the policymakers notice what all are the underlying economic strain, right? So let's see how we go about it. Then last sentence of the first para, welcome to the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization. So in a grand way he is welcoming कि आओ मैं तमाशा दिखाता हूं कि कितने इकोनॉमिक स्ट्रेन हैं और फिर भी पॉलिसी मेकर्स संतुष्ट बैठे हैं. So there is a tone of sarcasm, because when there is economic strain, why should policymakers not understand and analyze the problem and try to take corrective action? Why are they sitting complacent? हाथ पे हाथ धर के क्यों बैठे हैं? Why are they fooled by just GDP growth? Right? So he is sarcastically inviting you, आओ तमाशा देखो. So tamasha number 1 is that see the oil price. Oil price doubled in 18 months. And what are people saying? Don't worry, damn it. Once prices go up, automatically more people will get into oil production. So supply will increase, and naturally demand remaining same, the prices will again come back because now supply has increased. As Tommy Cooper used to say, just like that. So he ends the second para again in a sarcastic tone by saying that just like that it will happen. You think it's a joke? That oil prices, which has doubled in 18 months, right, are suddenly going to go back to $25 a barrel? So again, sarcastically, he's being sarcastic about those policymakers whose accepted wisdom is that supply will naturally increase because now price has gone up, more people will get into the business of producing oil, and therefore supply will increase and then prices will go down. So this is tamasha number one. Then comes tamasha number two. Now this, if I recall correctly, was the period 2002, when Europeans suddenly realized that their labor was rather costly, pampered with so many welfare measures, while similar labor in US and other competing economies like Japan, etc., they were not so well paid, so labor cost was not so high, and their products were internationally more competitive than the European economies. Particularly, France and Germany are the two big economies in Europe, right? So, European countries got together and decided that we also need to bring down our labor cost and make our labor laws a little flexible so that companies can negotiate wages and come down, reduce the burden on the labor cost. So a referendum was first held. So the French, in France particularly, the labor movement is rather strong, and they immediately said no, no labor reforms, because they saw these labor reforms as a hire and fire policy, that companies will get the flexibility of hire and fire, and thereby the very job security that the whole labor movement has fought to acquire, that would be lost. So let's look at how the author is showing this second tamasha, because the second tamasha is another strain, economic strain. So then there is the result of the French referendum on the European Constitution, which again is, what are the policymakers saying? They are seeing it as that these laborers are thick-headed Luddites. Now, thick-headed Luddites are militant labor who had rebelled when machines initially replaced labor. There was a Ned Ludd who was who used to lead bands who to go and destroy the machinery in factories. So from there, the word Luddite has come into the English language. So these labor are militant labor who are just fighting against the modern world. Now, this is what policymakers are saying. And policymakers are saying that what the French need to realize is that there is no alternative to the reforms that would make their country more flexible, more competitive, more dynamic. So, this is why they are trying to make laws flexible. But the author sees this as an economic strain and doesn't agree with the policymakers, because he is sarcastically then saying, now this is author's voice comes here, just the sort of reform that allowed Gate Gourmet to sack hundreds of his staff at Heathrow after the sort of ultimatum that used to be handed over by Victorian mill owners. So, Victorian times, the mill owners used to just say, fire. They used to fire the labor. Tomorrow you needn't come. Here's your pay. Get out. Right. So this is what Gate Gourmet had sacked hundreds of staff at the London Heathrow Airport and fired them from the job. So he's saying these are the sort of reforms. So he's being sarcastic about the policymakers who are trying to, say that labor, who are speaking in favor of labor reforms, right? While the author is saying that this kind of job insecurity, hire and fire situation is like a retrogressive step, because the labor movement has fought and we have reached such a level today. And now, when the French are refusing to accept this flexibility, you're trying to say that they are foolish. So he's being sarcastic about the policymakers. So an alternative way of looking at the French norm is their no to these reforms is that our neighbors is the British. They, uh, our neighbors are the French that translate flexibility as you're fired. So the author feels that you are getting in job insecurity through these labor reforms, which has been won after much uh, a strong labor movement in Europe, and all those gains are being lost by overnight by just making the labor laws flexible. So this obviously is causing a strain in the economy. If the labor is not sure of his job and there's no job security, he will feel uncomfortable. He won't be able to give his best in his job. And again, the overall instability in the labor force and the labor market will increase. So, this is the second strain that he is highlighting, that policymakers don't see this problem, that the labor is unhappy. So, in the previous two paras, we saw two. Welcome to the Edwardian summer. Tamasha number one, oil prices. Tamasha number two, job insecurity being felt by the labor in Europe. And finally, Tamasha number three, look at the US, the biggest economy, contributing almost 25% to the global GDP. So just like Britain a century ago, a period of unquestioned superiority is coming to a draw. China is, though way back, it is coming forward in terms of GDP. Today, we all know it's the second largest economy and kicking at the heels of the US economy, but then it was far behind. Uh, Now, moreover, beneath the surface of the US economy, all is not well. So, what is the third strain? The third strain, the US economy itself. What is the problem there? Let's have a look. He says a lot in the next two paras. Growth looks healthy enough, so GDP is okay, growth. But competition from China and elsewhere has meant that the world's biggest economy now imports far more than it exports. So what was happening during in that period 2005 and that phase was that China was making cheap goods and the whole Western world was buying. America, which is a big consumer, right? That is why their GDP is 25% of the global economy. 5% of the US population consume far more than most countries do, right? So cheap Chinese goods used to come. China used to earn US dollars, invest that US dollars back in the US treasury bills. So send the dollars back to the Federal Reserve Bank and buy their securities. So in a way, buy US debt. So China had over $3 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves in US treasury bills. So that means that is the money that the Central Bank of America owes to China. If China says, give me all my $3 trillion, here are your treasury bills, $3 trillion will be required to be given. And the GDP then of America was about 14 trillion. So the world's biggest economy now imports far more than it exports. So there's a big balance of payments difference between mainly, let's say, China and US. Let's just take us China and US so that easier to understand, right? So it is importing far more from China than it's overall exporting. So it is in debt. Its current account deficit is high, right? So US is living beyond its means. It's not earning enough through exports as it is spending through imports. But in this time of studied complacency, so policymakers are intentionally complacent. A current account deficit worth 6%. Now 6% of GDP of 14 trillion is a lot, right? They're seeing it as a sign of strength, not weakness. That means, what is the strength in this? How can you see this as a strength when you are virtually indebted as a country? You are importing more than you are exporting? Only because the fact is that Chinese factories are running because Americans are consuming it. So that 5% of world population in America is consuming, and that consuming is allowing the global economy to grow, allowing Chinese economy to grow, their factories to run, their labor to be employed, right? So that is the strength of the global economy, that it has great consumption, great capacity to consume the goods and services offered by other economies, right? They are not seeing it as a weakness of the US economy, but as a strength. Para 5. So, in this new Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization, so these three tamashas, these three clear economic strains he points out, and now he is kind of summing up that what do we policymakers, what are they missing? So policymakers are happy that though oil prices have doubled, etc., but it has not caused the inflation as in the oil shock of the 70s, right? When inflation had gone up to 27%, now inflation is only 2.3%. Now, why is inflation so low when oil prices have gone up? Simply because the West mature economies have conquered inflation. One is you have cheap Chinese goods coming, so inflation doesn't go up. Then people's basic needs are met by cheaper uh, available things. So they have now risen beyond that poverty level, and our majority are in the middle class. That inflation, as measured in terms of basic necessities and other things, those parameters remain low. So inflation is only 2.5%. So people are saying, why are you worrying about the oil prices? Last time oil prices went up, bloody inflation went to 27%. Now it's only 2.3%. So why are you making such a big fuss? This is what the policymakers are saying. Author is saying, yet the idea that higher oil prices are of little consequence is fanciful. That means don't ignore this fact. Higher oil prices are a problem. Let us see how are they a problem. If people are paying oil high for oil, right, and they are not consuming less, they are continuing to go in their gasoline guzzling SUVs from east to west coast for a holiday and here and there. So the consumption of oil is immense. That 5% of population virtually consumed at that time about 50% of the global oil. So much, if oil prices go up, no, their consumption cost should be very high, but they are not willing to reduce, they are not willing to cut down on their consumption. So what is happening? They are borrowing, and there is no limit to credit. In the economy, banks give freely because banks have to make profit, and the Federal Reserve Bank had kept the uh, Fed rate at almost 0.25. So money was cheap. Capital, the cost of capital was cheap. This was all to make sure that the GDP growth is there. So credit was encouraged. Interest rates were kept low, starting with their Federal Reserve Bank, and therefore there was no problem about consuming. You could consume as much, you could borrow and consume. So all households were debted. They never paid their credit card bills. So they were in all kinds of debt. The Federal Reserve Bank of America was in debt to outsiders like China. 3 trillion they owed to China. So these were the consequences. And in the 70s, prices went up because of other aspects. So I don't want to discuss that. Let's work on what is happening now. So households are invited to borrow more rather than consume less. So this is what is happening today. So the knock-on effects of higher oil prices are thus felt in different ways. Not in inflation, but in high levels of indebtedness. The Central Bank of America is indebted, all households are indebted, in inflated asset prices. property prices are inflated. So all that extra money supply in the economy because of low interest rates is not resulting in inflation rate going up, but is resulting in property prices going up, because that money has to, because there's demand for property, so property prices are going up. There's no demand for food because whatever food they need they're getting, there's enough of supply. So prices of food and other necessities, fuel, this, that, are not bothering them so much. The extra money supply is going into raising the prices of property, of share market, bond market, etc. So all the asset classes different. So their prices are inflated far more than what normal demand and supply forces should fix it at. So the effect of high oil prices, and of course the other aspects which I mentioned, all this is resulting in high levels of indebtedness, high property, share and stock prices, and in high balance of payment deficits. So the current account deficit is 6% of GDP, right? So this was an unhealthy situation as pointed out in this Guardian article. The Guardian article from which Cat directly, word by word, they've taken this passage, lifted from beginning till end, and he virtually was warning us about the global financial crisis, the subprime crisis, where anybody without his credit worthiness, he was being given loan to buy property, right? And the property market was booming, and we know what happened in 2008, 9, and subsequently, right? So this is the stage. In 2005, what we are seeing is the stage that was being set for the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Okay, let's see what the author, now let's come back to the passage. So, first para, he brings out the parallel between that time, earlier Edwardian summer and now Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization, shows three main areas of economic strain, and then in para 5 sums up the overall effect of this, especially in the world's largest economy, US. Let's see from this where he goes. So, having sarcastically brought out the three, let's say, areas of economic strain, now he is kind of summing up. So, let us see, para 6. There are those who point out rightly. That means the again a comment adverb, like we saw crucially. You see, the author is commenting by using such a adverb there. There he was saying it is crucial that the policy makers should not be complacent, but they are. They think they are living in the best worlds when things are not okay. Here also he's saying that those who point out are right. I agree with them that modern industrial capitalism has proved mightily resilient these past 250 years. So there is no cause for alarm as such, right? And the way modern capitalism has handled, let's say a stock market crash, then that 9/11 terrorist attack and rising oil prices, right? That shows that modern industrial capitalism is mightily resilient. So people who point this out, they are right, and I agree with them. Yet I would like to point out, now this is the author's voice, even so, there are at least three reasons for concern. So the choice of word is concern, not alarm, right? He's saying, let us be concerned about this. Let the policymakers not be complacent, right? First, you must see that we are at the same stage, similar kind of a stage than that we were at the end of the Edwardian summer of the first stage of globalization, right? We believe that capital flow, the whole world could be globalized, capital could flow from Japan to US, etc., etc. We believed in free trade, in the power of the market. We had this implicit faith that time also, as we have now, right? And that time also it was a time of massive income inequalities, as it is today, and unprecedented migration. People migrating from, let's say, weaker economies to stronger economies for better job prospects, etc. Eventually, though, if you remember, there was a backlash, and that was manifested in a struggle between people who were in favor of free trade and people who wanted to protect the industry so that their own people have jobs, and in rising labor militancy, which we can see now in the case of France, why the labor uh, there has said no to change or making labor laws flexible. So the first cause of concern is that we are at a similar stage as we were in 1901, 1910. This phase mirrors that, and we know what happened after that, the kind of economic problem, the wars, etc., that took place because we had faith in all these systems and it backfired. So these are like historical precedents he's talking about. Second, Second, the world is traditionally at its most fragile at times when the global balance of power is in flux. So now you can see then power of Britain was being challenged by the rise of United States, Germany, and Japan, while the Ottoman and Habsburg Empire were clearly on the decline, and World War One fully destroyed them. Right now, what is happening? Looking ahead from 2005, in the next 2 or 3 decades, 30 years from 2005, that is up to 2035, both China and India, which together account for half the world's population, will flex their muscles. So you can already see we have not reached 2035, but China now is very close to the American GDP. It has caught up quite a bit from that time and is flexing its muscles. We can see that happening today. So this author could kind of foresee that, and now you can see how fragile the world is, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen, and the whole stable globalized order that was functioning under the WTO, all that has gone for a six. The whole importance of WTO, UNO, everything is being questioned. Everything, we are probably going to de-globalize, and again, like already India is saying, uh, Atam, be self-reliant. So protectionist tendencies already coming in India. Okay, America also, America first. So Trump is saying, so that is protectionist. So what he highlighted as concern number one about that is also happening now. So all this fragility is there. Things are in a flux now. So this was a concern highlighted then. Finally, there is the question of rising oil prices. Now, India and China are growing. The poor people are becoming middle class. They're buying scooters, cars. They're using petrol. Industries coming up. They're using goods and services. There's a global demand for petroleum, crude oil. And experts are saying that the production is going to top out. That means under the earth there's not enough crude to be pumped. So if that be true, and future demand of China and India, this is being said in 2005, is going to double or triple, then and supply is not there, then price will shoot up. There'll be a long upward trend of oil prices. There could be some cyclic changes in between. Prices may go up and down a little bit. But if you draw a long term trend line, it'll be all going up. So that is the third cause of concern. If fuel prices keep going up like that, then economies will be shattered because so much of money just for energy. So this is how the author ends. by virtually highlighting the final three areas of concern, having already highlighted the areas of economic strain. Now let us see the questions. So there are three levels at which you read. One is what is stated there. So that is the literal level, right? Then what like what you can infer from what he's saying. That is the inferential level. Then based on how he has structured his whole thought flow, from there you can evaluate as to what was, let's say, his primary purpose. So one type of question, primary purpose question, is a very favorite of many examiners. In this you have to evaluate as to what is the primary purpose of the author in writing this article or this passage. Was it to draw parallels between two periods and draw lessons for the future? A little in the first para and a little in the second last para, he is drawing parallels. He is talking of historical precedents in the second last para. Right? In the beginning, he is just drawing some parallel that we are in a similar state. So that is part of the purpose, but that's obviously not the primary purpose. To highlight certain problems in the present period of globalization and offer solutions. Is he offering any solutions? He's not offering solutions that how we should reduce prices, how if world is in a flux, so how should we sort it out? He's not offering solutions. So two is out. To analyze certain problems in the present period and give a wake up call. Yes, that is his whole idea. He's saying, though modern capitalism has been resilient, and I agree with those who say so, yet there are three areas of concern. So the policy makers who are complacent just because there's GDP growth don't think that there are no problems. There are underlying economic problems. Please see them. They may take an ugly shape in the coming future. So wake up, understand, see what are the factors, and work towards it. Find solutions or take preemptive action. So, third is obviously his main purpose of writing, which is the primary purpose. Let's see fourth option, to analyze the present period of globalization and warn of dangers that lie ahead. Now, warn of dangers is alarmist. That is not his tone because he's already accepted that yes, global capitalism has been resilient, it can probably handle the present state also, but he's still giving you a wake up call that be aware of these factors, see them, don't uh, be blind to them, so that you can take some actions to mitigate their harmful effects in the future. So answer is three. Key argument question. So again, these are something you're assessing. He is making a couple of arguments, but what is his key argument? So let's see option one, the rise in oil prices. This was one of the problems he highlighted in para 2 when the Tommy Cooper one he mentions. Then in the last para, he again says that oil prices are going to rise. Flux in global balance of para, last but one, and historical precedents. So the last three paras virtually should make us question our belief that the global economic prosperity would continue. So these are the causes for concern, these three causes for concern clearly mentioned in the last three paras. So one is his basic argument that these these three problems should make us be concerned and not just be blinded by GDP growth and that it will continue. Things may go wrong. Take preemptive action. So the answer is one. Let us see other options. The belief that modern industrial capitalism is highly resilient and capable of overcoming shocks will be belied soon. He's not saying it will be belied soon, he's just waking you up. Right? He's not saying that modern industrial capitalism is going to fail now. Earlier it has been resilient, but now it's going to fail. Three, widespread prosperity leads to neglect of all this and all this. Now, leads is a present simple tense. That means it is showing habitual action. Like, I go for a walk every morning. I lead a simple life. So this prosperity leads to this. That means as if it always happens. So this is not what he's saying. It happened during one time and now it's again happening. Doesn't mean it always happens. So three, obviously the very grammar, the choice of the verb tense is a problem. Then four, a crisis is imminent in the West. No, this is not. Again, his tone is of caution, of concern, not of alarm. He's not saying that you're going to have a big problem. Probably he didn't foresee so much about the global financial crisis happening, because that was truly a crisis which happened in 3 years after he said this, right? So a crisis is imminent when given the growth of countries like China and India and the increase in oil prices. So this was not his key argument. So answer of 2 is 1. So we saw two questions of the evaluate level where you had to evaluate as to what was his primary purpose, which are his key arguments, or what is his main argument, right? Because separating the main from the minor, or primary from the secondary and tertiary, you have to make an evaluation as a reader. He doesn't say my primary purpose is this, my secondary purpose is this, my tertiary purpose is this. He doesn't state it and make it into a boring reading exercise, right? Like you do in a textbook and from where you mug up and give exams, right? So that is where you have to evaluate based on your understanding of the whole passage. Now comes to inference. Inference from certain meaning in context. Something has been said there from in context, what did that mean, right? So that is an inference, because you can't take the literal meaning of what is stated. What is the in between the lines that you can read? So let us see question 3. What can be inferred about the author's view when he states, as Tommy Cooper used to say, just like that? So there was some maybe a TV host show, Tommy Cooper, who had this habit of saying just like that, right? That just like that is going to happen just like that. So that obviously is being quoted as sarcasm to those policymakers in para 2 who say that, listen, if oil prices are going up, so it will become more lucrative for people to drill oil and produce more oil. So naturally supply will increase. Once supply increases, then prices will again come down. So why are you worrying? And the author is mocking that with sarcasm by saying, as Tommy Cooper used to say, just like that. So obviously the author thinks that oil prices are not going to go down. So 4 is the answer. It is not necessary that oil prices would go down to earlier levels. That just because prices have gone up and therefore it will be greater incentive to supply more oil because now it's lucrative, and therefore then prices will go down. So it's not a joke. It's not going to happen that way. This is what clearly the author feels, and that is why he's being sarcastic about those people who say so. Let's see the other options all the same. Industry has incentive to build new production, refining, and therefore oil prices will reduce. This is not the author's view. There would be a correction in oil prices once new. This is not the author's view. He is being sarcastic about people who think this. The decline in oil price is likely to be short term in nature. This short term, long term is not the point here, because he is uh, he does say in the last para, not in the second para, that there will be a long uh, upward trend of oil prices, and there could be cyclic variations. And short term they could go up and down, etc. But long term they're going to go up. That now is in the last para, not in this para in which we are quoting this statement from. So 3 doesn't fit in there, and so 4 is the answer. By the expression Edwardian summer, the author refers to a period in which there is. So the very first para, when he sarcastically says, "Aao tamasha dekho, welcome to the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization." So Edwardian summer is obviously a tamasha wala time when policy makers are sleeping, they are complacent, GDP growth is there, so they are happy, they see prosperity around, but they don't see the underlying economic strain, the problems that are brewing up, right? So obviously, Edwardian summer, what you can infer from there is a sense of complacency of the policymakers who think that there couldn't be a better situation because of all round prosperity. So, the real problem is that people are not able to see beyond the GDP growth and hence they are complacent. So, again, inferential level, the rest of the options are, do not, because this is clear. Edwardian summer has now come to mean this. It's part of English language now. Okay, question 5. Here I've written it's a specific details question. You're being tested at the literal level. So, what is actually stated in the passage? So, these answers to this question will come directly from what is stated. What, according to the author, has resulted in a widespread belief in the resilience of modern capitalism? That he said is, if you remember in that para, he had said that it is because the way the global economy or modern capitalism has handled all the shocks. There was a stock market shock, there was a 9/11 attack, and rising oil prices. How these problems were thrown at it, and it has been able to handle all this. So that is what was literally stated there. So obviously, what do we look at? Option 3, growth, continued growth of Western economies despite a rise in terrorism, that 9/11, increase in oil prices, and other shocks like that stock market uh, shock, right? So 3 is the answer. The other options, let's just go through them. Option 1, growth in the economy despite shocks in the form of increase in the level of indebtedness and inflated. This is knock on effects of higher oil prices. This is not stated in relation with the widespread belief in resilience, right? Increase in the prosperity of Western countries and China despite this is not right. For the success of continued reforms aimed at making Western economies more dynamic, this is bullshit. Okay, now we come to another type of question which is called the logical development question. Here, the examiner is trying to ask you that if author has said something, with what purpose has he said it? How does it fit into the logical development of his thought flow? So, again, you have to evaluate the reason why he said so. So, the author comments just the sort of reform that allowed Gate Gourmet to sack hundreds of his staff at Heathrow after the sort of ultimatum that used to be handed out by Victorian mill owners. He comments this in order to highlight which of the following points. So, what was the purpose of this statement? He was sarcastically telling those people who are criticizing the French labor, right, and who want to make labor laws flexible, that you are jeopardizing their job security, right? So, in the name of reform, just like this guy, Gate Gourmet, sacked hundreds of people by giving overnight notice, and hundreds of people just without any jobs overnight. I mean, in an advanced welfare capitalist economy, can you do that? It is unacceptable. So, in the option 1, in the name of reform, the labor in Europe, by making labor laws flexible, you're depriving them of employment security, which they have enjoyed for so long, for which they have fought for so long, and labor laws have been passed in different parliaments for so much, and now they have this security. Now you suddenly want to take all that away from them. So his purpose of saying this was to highlight that in the name of reform, you are actually depriving them of employment security. Uh, what else? Let's see other options. Making labor laws flexible will make Europe internationally competitive. This is what the policymakers are saying. Author is making fun of that this reform will steal job security. So it's harmful rather than beneficial. Making labor laws flexible will take us back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, this is a separate aspect. The pressures of competition in world trade are being felt by European labor, which have been pampered so far. So, because of that, they're trying to change labor laws, but French labor is saying no. So, it's response to that that the author is saying they're saying no because their job security is at stake. So, we should be concerned that their job security is not lost in the name of reforms. We should not lose a gain we have made after so many years of evolution of our capitalistic system. Okay, question 7. Which are the signs of underlying economic strength that the author invites the reader to witness while welcoming him to the Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization? So that he invites them in the first para, second, third, fourth para are what are the underlying economic strength, oil prices, that French labor saying no to reforms, and third, the state of the US economy, which is living beyond its means, imports more than exports. So, obviously, the answer is 4. Rising oil prices, non acceptance of labor reform by the French because they fear that it'll create job insecurity, and the high current account deficit in the US economy, which some people see it as a sign of strength rather than a weakness, right? Which we'll see now in the next question. So, answer of 7 is 4. Let's see question 8. Here, you have to kind of evaluate as to those policy makers who see it as a sign of strength, who are complacent in the current arrangement of things, right? How, in which way can they see it as a sign of strength? So, in which possible way can policymakers see the high current account deficit in the US economy as a sign of strength and not a weakness? So, option 1, other economies are dependent on US consumption for their sustained growth. So, as you are aware that there are two sides in an economy, there is the demand and the supply. It is demand that pushes growth. So, all the Keynesian economists talk of demand, that it is demand that pushes growth. So, US demand is high. US 5% of US citizens consume a lot, right? So that is why even if they live beyond their means and import more than they export, they earn less money than they spend money outside, right? That is only showing great demand in the US economy, which is a strength. Because if there's great demand today, it will also encourage industry within the economy to come up. And so demand, having high demand itself in an economy is a sign of strength. So this is one possible way in which the policy makers can see this high current account deficit, that we have a higher demand than we can meet ourselves, and therefore we are meeting it from others, mainly China and Asia, and well, their economies are sustaining because of our demand. So it was once said that if the US economy even sneezes, the whole of Asia or the Asian economy contacts pneumonia. So this is how. So if US, due to any reason, the sentiment of consumption goes down, let's say 9/11 attack or the any kind of fear or this thing that stops US consumption, the ripples are felt straight away in the exporting economies who've been depending on export oriented growth throughout. That has been their growth pattern. So therefore, this is a very cozy, in this cozy arrangement between US and Asia, US consumption is keeping those economies going. So there's certainly a sign of strength. Other options, of course, show overall strength of the US economy and US as a nation, but uh, it is this demand. This is what is one possible way. Two, that US can continue to live on borrowed money because it's the largest economy. Now this doesn't make sense, right? Sooner or later you have to return that money, right? US is the most powerful nation, so we are not having a war here. US dollar is the reserve currency, yes, but yet there are rules. There's a global monetary system within which it operates. Maintaining a high current deficit by importing oil. Okay, so if you're importing oil, allows US to conserve its own oil reserves for future use. This is a little stretch because uh, the oil is cheap, that's why you're importing it. But why are you living beyond your means? Why aren't you exporting enough and first earning enough and then using the earned money to import? Why are you going into deficit? Why are you having a high 6% current account deficit? So 4 is not satisfactory. So answer of 8 is 1. So from questions 1 to 8, we have seen one literal level questions, some inferential level questions, some at the evaluative level, like primary purpose, key argument. Now here are 4 questions which rarely come or come just once in a while, but again here you have to evaluate, right? So all these 4 questions, 9, 10, 11, 12, are on evaluative level of meaning. So question 9, what is the tone of the author in the last 3 paras of the passage, where the author says, even so, there are 3 reasons for concern? His tone is obviously cautionary. He's giving a wake up call. He's not alarming you that a crisis is imminent, right? He is not really critical in the last 3 paras, though he may be sarcastic and critical earlier. He's not exhortative. He's not exhorting you, come on, wake up and act fast, immediate. He's just cautioning you that wake up from your slumber and look at things. Maybe you can take preemptive action before things get out of hand. What is the overall style of the passage? So, obviously, the author is not expository, means explaining things. Is he giving us some information? Would be informative. Is it describing? Describing is normally something you see with your eyes. Let's say I'm describing the beauty of nature or the beauty of a historical monument. So description comes into in fictional novels normally. Narration of a story with describing of character, how it's dressed, the setting of a room, etc. So descriptive doesn't fit in at all. He is here basically persuading you to a viewpoint. He's telling you that these policymakers are asleep on the wheel. They are complacent, thinking that prosperity is masking, is theirs, nothing to worry, right? They are unable to see the underlying economic strains. So please, the underlying economic strains could reach ugly levels. And these and there how that's how he builds 3 areas of concern for argues that these 3 areas of concern should wake you up to action. So he is being argumentative by persuading, by creating arguments to persuade the policymaker to wake up and take note of the weaknesses, the strains in the economy. So question 10 answer is 2. 11, which of the following would be the most suitable title of the passage? The Edwardian summer of the second age of globalization, that seems to be very attractive, right? But when you are asked suitable title in RC questions, you should choose the one not which is attractive otherwise, as you would do, if you're writing an essay or some other situation. Here, it is to test whether you've got the essence of the passage or not, right? The examiner is trying to test you for the essence of the passage. Now, Edwardian summer itself, either you know the meaning or you don't. Now, the essence of Edwardian summer is that all round prosperity is masking strains in the global economy. So, 4 would make a more suitable title, because if somebody reads this title, all around prosperity masking strains in the global economy, he has clearly got his thoughts in advance focused, oriented towards, and then he starts reading the article or the RC passage. It will follow beautifully right from the first para, right? And then he'll understand that Edwardian summer, these are the features of the Edwardian summer. And then throughout, this is the essence of the passage. That policymakers are complacent because all around prosperity is marking strains in the global economy. So policymakers should wake up. So 11 answer is 4. Likely source of passage. Now, this I have rarely come across, but the idea of making this question was to uh, tell you that such questions can also be asked under evaluative level of meaning. Now, you have already in preparation for CAT been reading the Guardian, the Hindu, Eon, and so many other foreign journals. You already got a feel of what is the kind of language, journalistic language they use, right? Uh, the kind of technical aspects also, like you may have found, if you don't have knowledge of economics, you may find this passage rather economical, rather heavy in economics, right? What is current account deficit? Now, you know all educated people are supposed to know that author, who the original person who wrote the article in the Guardian, right? So this passage has been taken from, uh, let's say, opinion column of the Guardian. Okay, so the answer of this question is the editorial page of a newspaper or an opinion column of a newspaper or journal, right? It doesn't have to be for economists. The layman should know about this. Every layman should be concerned that US economy is this, oil prices are causing this problem, right? Every ordinary, so such things come in ordinary newspapers for the layman, but for the educated layman, you don't have the language. Nowhere is jargon ridden, full of economic jargon, Keynesian. In fact, while explaining, I introduce more jargon than otherwise, right? So obviously, it is not a journal in a journal for economists. It is not a paper prepared by IMF on the state of the global economy, because then the language wouldn't be this. He wouldn't be talking of just as Tommy Cooper used to say, in a formal kind of a journal for economists or in an IMF paper, you can't be sarcastic and you can't use tone like that. Neither can you do it in a research paper. So the very language and the lack of technical jargon in it, right, shows that it is a editorial page of a newspaper. So therefore, answer is 2. So I hope you have understood that when you read, there are 3 levels you're reading at. One is you're seeing the words as stated. From there, you're trying to read in between lines. Okay, what is he implying? What can be inferred from what he has said? And then you're forming a mind map of the structure and evaluating what are his key arguments, what is the basic purpose or main idea or primary purpose of his writing, and so on, right? So with this, we come to the end of today's reading task. Thank you.